This HOA Karen thought she could destroy my mailbox and get away with it, but she just started a federal war she couldn't win, and the final showdown will shock you. I was mid-bite into my lunch, a delicious turkey sandwich, when my world tilted. Through the window, I saw her, Brenda, our notorious HOA enforcer, yanking my mailbox out of the ground as if it were a stubborn weed. Mayonnaise dripped onto my shirt, my jaw hung open, and there she was, teetering on stilettos, wrestling with what I knew was federal property. "Hey, what in the world are you doing?" I spluttered, still chewing. "Are you actually stealing my mailbox?" Her face, a mask of self-righteous fury mixed with triumph, flushed crimson. It was as if I'd interrupted a heroic quest. "This is an eyesore," she shrieked, tugging harder. "The HOA voted on new mailbox standards, and yours doesn't comply. I'm saving our neighborhood, saving the neighborhood from my perfectly legal, unassuming mailbox." I just stood there, sandwich still in hand, utterly bewildered. Was this woman serious? She wasn't bluffing. She genuinely believed she had the power to uproot federal property because it didn't fit her bizarre vision of suburban perfection. By the time I reached her, the whole thing was out, concrete base and all, dragged onto the sidewalk like some grotesque trophy. My mail, actual letters, bills, even a small package, spilled into the dirt. That was the pivotal moment, wasn't it? This wasn't just a petty neighbor dispute. This was the beginning of something much, much bigger. And Brenda, oh, she had no idea how deep a hole she was digging for herself. I didn't scream, didn't threaten. Instead, a slow, knowing smile spread across my face. Why? Because mailboxes aren't homeowner property. They belong to the United States Postal Service. Brenda, in her self-appointed role as neighborhood sheriff, had just declared war on the federal government. While she huffed and puffed about property values and aesthetic cohesion, I calmly pulled out my phone and snapped photos. Every angle, her hands on the box, my mail on the ground, the fresh gouges where she dragged it. She noticed, of course. "You can't take pictures of me without my consent," she barked. "Oh, don't worry," I replied, my voice unnervingly calm. "It's not for me, it's for the postal inspector." That stopped her cold. She blinked, utterly bewildered, then doubled down. "The HOA has jurisdiction here. I don't care what the mail police say." Mail police, that was my cue. Brenda was playing checkers, and I was already setting up a chessboard. I waved cheerfully, went back inside, and dialed the post office. The woman on the other end barely let me finish before her tone shifted from polite customer service to deadly serious. "Sir, did you say your neighbor removed your mailbox without authorization, concrete base and all?" "Yes, ma'am," I confirmed. "That's a federal offense," she stated flatly. "Tampering with a mailbox is punishable by fines up to $50,000 and even prison time." I nearly choked on the last bite of my sandwich. $50,000? A tiny part of me, I admit, felt a pang of something akin to pity. Brenda didn't know she'd just turned her little HOA power trip into a federal felony. But then I remembered her smug face, the way she dismissed me as if I were the crazy one for objecting. No, the pity vanished, not one bit. The very next morning, a shiny USPS vehicle pulled up. A man in a crisp uniform, clipboard in hand, stepped out. He surveyed the gaping hole in my lawn, the scattered mail, and Brenda's muddy heel prints leading right to the scene of the crime. Brenda, naturally, emerged like she was the welcoming committee. She strutted up to the inspector, waving her manicured hand. "I'm the head of the HOA Aesthetics Committee," she declared. "That mailbox was non-compliant, so I removed it." "You're welcome." The inspector didn't even blink. He flipped a page on his clipboard. "Ma'am, did you personally remove this federally owned mailbox?" "Yes," she chirped proudly. "I did." He looked at me, then back at her, then scribbled something down. "Thank you for your confession," he said, his voice level. Her smile faltered. "Confession? What are you talking about?" He adjusted his sunglasses. "Tampering with, destroying or removing a mailbox is a federal crime. You've admitted in front of witnesses to committing that crime. You will be receiving a notice of violation and potential fines." I swear, the color drained from her face faster than a sink with no stopper. She stammered something about HOA bylaws, neighborhood standards, how she was just enforcing community rules. The inspector cut her off. "Ma'am, the HOA has no authority over federal property. You are personally liable." That was it. The smugness, the arrogance, the absolute certainty she could control everyone. It all evaporated in one horrifying second of real-world consequence. But here's the kicker. That wasn't even the twist. The real shocker came later when the HOA itself tried to cover for her. They sent me a letter claiming I was in violation of mailbox standards and needed to install one of their approved designs within 30 days. They thought they could bully me into silence, make the whole incident disappear by pretending I was at fault. What they didn't realize was that I had a federal inspector on my side, photos of Brenda mid-crime, and the law itself backing me. I wasn't just playing defense anymore. I was setting the stage for the biggest checkmate of my life. As I reread that HOA letter, under the warm glow of my kitchen light, I couldn't help but grin. I knew exactly how this was going to end. Not with me paying them, but with Brenda, and maybe the entire HOA board, facing a bill that made my torn-up lawn look like pocket change. That was just the beginning. When the HOA letter slid under my door, I almost burst out laughing. Printed on cream-colored stationery, embossed with their pompous little logo, an oak tree surrounded by Latin words that probably meant, "We think we're better than you." The tone was precisely what you'd expect. Legal-sounding nonsense, mixed with pure condescension. According to them, my unauthorized mailbox removal had created a visual disruption to the neighborhood's harmony. Unless I installed a new, HOA-approved model within 30 days, I'd face fines of $500 a day. I sat there, holding the letter, picturing Brenda in her kitchen, sipping wine, congratulating herself on fixing the problem. She'd probably written half the letter herself, whispering over the board president's shoulder, dictating every word. It was almost poetic, wasn't it? She ripped out my mailbox, and now the HOA was demanding that I fix the hole she left behind. You couldn't make this up. Most people would panic at the thought of being fined $500 a day. Most people would rush to the hardware store, buy whatever ugly mailbox the HOA demanded, and quietly swallow their pride. But I'm not most people. I knew something the HOA didn't. Their letter was meaningless compared to the little stack of documents now sitting on my kitchen counter. The postal inspector had given me copies, official papers, stamped and signed, confirming that the USPS had opened an investigation into my neighbor's crime. Those papers weren't threats printed on fancy stationery. They were the law. Still, I decided to play it cool. Instead of writing back, I taped the HOA's letter to my fridge and went about my day. I wanted them to think I was ignoring them, stewing in fear. In reality, I was waiting for the hammer to drop. 2 days later, a USPS vehicle returned to the neighborhood. But this time, it wasn't just one inspector. There were two, and they brought a clipboard stacked an inch high with papers. I watched from my window as they walked directly to Brenda's house. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see everything. Brenda in her driveway, wearing yoga pants, and that smug grin, arms crossed as she tried to look powerful. She did her usual routine, lots of hand-waving, pointing at my yard, making dramatic faces. The inspectors didn't even flinch. They took notes, handed her a packet, and left without another word. 15 minutes later, my phone rang. It was my friend Chris, who lived 2 houses down, and had front row seats to Brenda's meltdown. He was practically crying with laughter. "She's screaming on the phone," he gasped between laughs. "I think she just realized this isn't an HOA issue. It's federal. She keeps yelling, 'You can't fine me that much,' and slamming doors." By dinner time, word had spread around the block. Neighbors strolled past my house with subtle grins, whispering to each other. Brenda's crusade for neighborhood perfection had backfired spectacularly, and everyone knew it. The HOA board members, usually so bold about shoving their rules down our throats, suddenly looked nervous. One of them, a man named Mark, who'd lived here for 15 years, even stopped me while I was taking out the trash. "Hey," he muttered awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck, "about that mailbox thing. Maybe we went too far. Just forget about that letter already." I tilted my head, pretending to be confused. "The one threatening me with $500 a day? Yeah, that one." He laughed nervously. "It's just, standard language. Nothing personal." "Of course, I said calmly. Nothing personal, just extortion. Mark didn't know how to respond. He gave me a weak smile and shuffled away. That's when I realized the board was scared, not of me, but of the fallout. Brenda had dragged the HOA into something bigger than they ever anticipated, and now they were trying to distance themselves. But Brenda herself wasn't backing down. Oh no, she doubled down. The very next morning, she planted a brand new mailbox at the edge of my yard. Not just any mailbox, either. It was one of those gaudy HOA-approved monstrosities, had painted beige, trimmed with fake gold accents, and topped with a decorative eagle that looked like it had been ordered off a discount website. She even installed it at a crooked angle, so it leaned slightly as if it were embarrassed to exist. Then she knocked on my door, smiling as if she'd just done me a huge favor. "There," she announced. "Problem solved. You should be thanking me. I saved you from thousands in fines." I stared at the lopsided thing, then back at her. "You do realize that mailbox is evidence, right?" Her smile froze. "Evidence of what?" "Federal mail tampering, destruction of property, installation of an unauthorized receptacle. Pick one." Her jaw tightened, but she tried to recover. "You're being ridiculous. It's regulation approved." "No," I corrected. "It's HOA approved. Big difference. And the Postal Service doesn't care what your committee thinks." Brenda's face twitched. For the first time, I saw cracks in her confidence. She muttered something about talking to the board and stormed off, her heels clacking angrily on the pavement. That afternoon, the inspectors came back again. I waved them over and showed them Brenda's replacement. One of them took one look at it and sighed. "Sir, we'll handle this. You don't need to do anything further." It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. Within a week, Brenda received an official fine from the USPS, $50,000. The number looked surreal, even when my friend texted me a blurry photo of the notice. Brenda, the woman who once bragged about never paying a late fee in her life, now owed more money than some people make in a year, all because she couldn't stand the sight of my perfectly normal mailbox. But here's the kicker. Instead of quietly accepting her fate, Brenda decided to fight. She hired a lawyer. Not a good one, mind you. Probably the cheapest she could find. But still, she lawyered up, and in doing so, she opened the door for something I hadn't even considered. Discovery. See, when you sue or get sued, documents become public record, and when Brenda tried to argue that she was just following HOA orders, the inspector subpoenaed HOA meeting notes, emails, and communications. That's when the real bomb dropped. Turns out, Brenda had been pestering the HOA for months about non-compliant mailboxes. She'd sent emails filled with all-caps rants, photos of people's yards, and even threats to personally enforce the rules if the board didn't act. And the board? They hadn't approved a single thing. They'd ignored her. She wasn't acting on orders. She was acting on her own obsession, which meant the HOA's desperate letter to me, the one threatening fines, wasn't about rules at all. It was damage control. They thought if they pressured me into fixing the mess, it might cover for Brenda's insanity. Instead, they just handed investigators a paper trail of their own cowardice. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee, scrolling through the leaked documents my friend had forwarded me. The whole neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. And me, I felt calm, because this wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. This was about power, control, and the moment when people who think they're untouchable finally trip over their own arrogance. By the time Brenda hired her lawyer, the neighborhood had turned into something out of a soap opera. People weren't just gossiping over fences anymore. They were setting out lawn chairs to watch. My quiet cul-de-sac had transformed into a stage, and Brenda, whether she liked it or not, was the star. I first realized things had truly shifted when I came home from work one evening and found a small cluster of neighbors gathered on my driveway. They weren't there to complain. They were there to thank me. One woman, an older neighbor who'd lived here for decades, leaned in conspiratorially and whispered, "We've all been waiting for someone to stand up to her. Don't back down." Another handed me a plate of cookies, which frankly felt like a suburban version of supplying ammunition. I accepted their support graciously, though I stayed measured. "It's not me standing up to her," I told them. "It's the law. I'm just letting gravity do its thing." Meanwhile, Brenda had gone full general at war. She'd taken to walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard, knocking on doors demanding people sign a petition in her favor. The petition, as I later heard, was laughable. She wanted neighbors to attest that her mailbox demolition was a community service. When most people refused, she doubled down, telling them they'd regret it when property values dropped because of sloppy yards and mismatched mailboxes. Her lawyer wasn't much better, a short man with greasy hair and a cheap suit. He showed up to one of the USPS hearings, looking like he'd just come from defending a DUI. He tried to argue that Brenda's actions were protected under HOA bylaw. The inspector cut him off immediately. "Sir, no private organization has authority over federal property. It should have ended there. A sensible person, or at least a sensible lawyer, would have advised Brenda to settle, apologize and pay the fine." But Brenda was not sensible. She instructed her lawyer to file counterclaims against me, against the HOA, even against the Postal Service itself. I nearly spit out my coffee when I heard she had actually accused the USPS of malicious harassment for daring to fine her. Her claim against me was that I'd entrapped her by intentionally keeping a non-compliant mailbox, just to provoke her into removing it. She even dragged the HOA in, accusing them of negligence for not backing her up more forcefully. It was absurd. But here's where it got interesting. Once lawsuits entered the mix, everything had to go on record. And those records? Public. That's how I ended up sitting in my living room one night, with my neighbor Mark, the same HOA board member who tried to smooth things over earlier, reading through the mountain of discovery documents. The HOA's emails revealed they'd been terrified of Brenda for years. She wasn't just pushy, she was relentless. She'd flooded their inboxes with complaints about lawn ornaments, trash cans left out a few minutes too long, even children's chalk drawings on sidewalks. She'd threatened to sue the board before, claiming they weren't enforcing community standards. "See this?" Mark said, pointing to one particularly wild email. She said she'd personally repaint someone's front door if we didn't force them to change the color. She showed up at their house with a paint roller once. I blinked. "You let her stay on the board after that?" Mark sighed. "You don't get it. She's exhausting. Most of us figured it was easier to placate her than fight. But this," he gestured at the stack of papers, "this might finally be what ends her." I wasn't so sure. Brenda had an uncanny ability to make things worse for herself, but she also thrived on chaos. Losing wasn't a possibility in her mind. It was just another step in a bigger battle. And right on cue, she escalated again. The day before the first court date, Brenda organized an HOA emergency meeting in the community center. I went, mostly out of morbid curiosity. The room was packed. More neighbors than I'd ever seen show up for anything. Brenda stood at the front with her clipboard, her lawyer hovering awkwardly behind her. "This community is under attack," she declared dramatically. "Our property values are threatened by people who refuse to follow the rules. The HOA board has failed us, and the Postal Service has overstepped their authority. If we don't unite, this neighborhood will fall apart." It was the kind of speech you'd expect at a town hall meeting in a dystopian movie. She gestured wildly, her face turning red, her voice cracking. Some people shifted uncomfortably, others rolled their eyes, but a small handful, her loyalists, nodded along like she was delivering gospel truth. When she finally paused for breath, I raised my hand. "Quick question," I said calmly. "How exactly is the Postal Service overstepping their authority when mailboxes legally belong to them?" The room fell silent. Brenda glared at me. "You set me up," she hissed. "You knew the rules were confusing. You're hiding behind technicalities." "Technicalities," I repeated. "That's what you're calling federal law?" The lawyer stepped forward, trying to rein her in, but the damage was done. Half the room erupted in laughter. The other half muttered about wasted time. The board adjourned the meeting early, and Brenda stormed out fuming. The next day in court was even worse for her. Her lawyer tried his HOA argument again. The judge listened for about 30 seconds before cutting him off. "Counselor, are you seriously suggesting that a homeowners association supersedes federal law?" Her lawyer stammered. Brenda interrupted, shouting from the gallery that the judge didn't understand how important neighborhood aesthetics were. That earned her a sharp warning about contempt of court. I kept my composure, as always, calm, polite, precise. When asked for my testimony, I simply recounted the facts. I described the day I caught her ripping out the mailbox. I submitted the photos I'd taken. I presented the original HOA letter threatening me with fine. It all painted a clear picture. Brenda had gone rogue, and the HOA had tried to cover their tracks. The judge didn't issue a ruling that day. It was just a preliminary hearing, but the writing was on the wall. Brenda was spiraling. Her lawyer was floundering, and the HOA was desperately trying to distance themselves. And here's the part that really sealed it. The neighborhood itself began to split into factions. On one side, you had Brenda's dwindling supporters, people too stubborn or too frightened to cross her. On the other, you had everyone else, fed up with years of her bullying, and finally emboldened by watching her crash and burn. It became a kind of unspoken social experiment. Kids made jokes about mailbox mayhem at the bus stop. Adults whispered about how they hoped the fine would bankrupt her. And through it all, I remained calm, sipping my coffee on the porch, watching as Brenda tried to hold together an empire that was already crumbling beneath her. But I knew we weren't at the climax yet. Brenda still had tricks left. And when cornered, people like her don't quietly surrender. They ignite. I just didn't realize how big that fire would get. I thought Brenda might finally recognize the writing on the wall. The fine was looming. The HOA had distanced itself. Neighbors were turning against her in droves. But if there's one thing I've learned about people like Brenda, it's this: logic isn't a roadblock. It's just another speed bump they think they can blast through. Her solution, if you can call it that, came the very next week. I woke up to the sound of engines, 2 police cruisers, and a tow truck idling right in front of my house. My first thought was that something serious had happened, maybe an accident. But then I saw her, Brenda, standing in her driveway, bathrobe flapping in the breeze, waving her arms dramatically as she pointed toward my lawn. I slipped on shoes and walked outside calmly, coffee in hand. One of the officers turned toward me, already looking annoyed. "Sir, your neighbor filed a complaint. She claims you're harboring stolen federal property." I almost choked on my drink. "Stolen federal property?" I asked, incredulous. "You mean the mailbox that she ripped out of the ground?" Brenda butted in, practically foaming at the mouth. "That's exactly what I said, officer. He removed it himself and then framed me for it. He planted a fake one to get me fined." The officer gave me a look that screamed, "I don't get paid enough for this." "Do you have proof of ownership for the mailbox?" he asked. I couldn't resist a smirk. "Actually, officer, no one owns the mailbox. It's federal property, but I do have proof of destruction and tampering." I pulled out the packet of documents the postal inspector had given me, complete with photos of Brenda mid-crime, her signature on the HOA's correspondence, and even her written admission at the HOA meeting. The officer flipped through the papers, his expression going from irritated to amused. Finally, he handed them back. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "filing a false police report is a crime. I suggest you stop before you dig yourself into a deeper hole." Brenda's face turned a shade of red. I didn't think was humanly possible. She sputtered, stomped her foot, and screamed about conspiracy. The officers had heard enough. They left without another word, the tow truck following behind. And I went back inside, finished my coffee, and let the quiet satisfaction wash over me. But Brenda wasn't done. If she couldn't win through the HOA or the courts, she'd escalate higher. 2 days later, we all received flyers shoved into our mail slots. The headline screamed, "Protect our community from government overreach." The flyer was pure Brenda, dramatic, paranoid, and written like a manifesto. She accused the Postal Service of tyranny, the HOA of cowardice, and me of being an instigator who despises neighborhood values. At the bottom, she invited everyone to a rally at the community park that Saturday, promising guest speakers and media coverage. I almost ignored it. Almost. But curiosity got the better of me. The rally was predictably a disaster. About 15 people showed up, most of them looking bored, hoping for entertainment. Brenda had set up a folding table, covered in printouts, poster boards with slogans like "Save Our Mailboxes" and "Freedom from Fines," and even a megaphone she barely knew how to use. Her guest speaker turned out to be her cousin, a self-proclaimed constitutional expert who worked at a tire shop. He ranted about how the Founding Fathers never intended for mailboxes to be controlled by the government. Someone asked him if he'd ever read the actual law. He admitted he hadn't. Neighbors laughed openly. Kids filmed TikToks mocking the whole scene. By the end, Brenda was red-faced, screaming at everyone that they'd regret not standing with her when the feds came for their home. That's when I realized something important. Brenda wasn't just embarrassing herself anymore. She was uniting the neighborhood, not under her banner, but against her. The HOA, terrified of being dragged down further, called an emergency meeting of their own. This time, they invited me. The board president, a weary-looking retiree named Susan, laid it out plainly. "We're filing for a restraining order," she said. "Brenda's behavior has gone from disruptive to dangerous. We're also drafting a vote for removal from the board." It was a bold move, considering Brenda had always dominated them through sheer force of personality. But the USPS case had shifted the balance. They weren't scared of her anymore. They were scared of the liability she represented. The vote was scheduled for the following week, and you could feel the tension in the air. Neighbors whispered about it like it was the Super Bowl. Bets were placed. Some people even planned watch parties for the announcement. Brenda, of course, didn't take the news quietly. She went door to door again, this time screaming through people's Ring cameras when they wouldn't answer. She left angry notes taped to mailboxes, ironically yet again tampering with federal property. My personal favorite read: "If you vote me out, this neighborhood will collapse." The night of the vote was electric. The community center was packed, standing room only. The board called for order, though it was hard to hear over the chatter. When Brenda strutted in, clipboard in hand, the room erupted in a mix of boos and laughter. She tried to shout them down, but it was useless. The board president read the motion: removal of Brenda from the HOA board, effective immediately, due to misconduct, harassment, and bringing federal liability upon the community. Ballots were distributed. People marked their choices with the kind of glee usually reserved for talent shows. When the votes were tallied, it wasn't even close. 85% in favor of removal, 15% abstained, 0 in her favor. Brenda stood there, stunned. For once she was speechless, but only for a moment. Then she erupted. She screamed at the board, at the neighbors, at me. She swore she'd sue every single person in the room. She promised she'd call the media, the governor, even the president if she had to. Security escorted her out. Yes, security. 2 off-duty cops the HOA had hired in anticipation of exactly this kind of meltdown. She kicked and screamed all the way to the parking lot, while neighbors filmed the spectacle on their phones. By the next morning, videos of her tantrum were circulating on social media. Mailbox Brenda meltdown became the neighborhood's unofficial meme. Even the local news picked it up, running a segment that ended with the anchor barely hiding a smirk as she described the $50,000 fine still hanging over her head. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. Kids rode bikes without being yelled at. People put up Halloween decorations without nasty notes appearing on their doors. The HOA even admitted she'd been their biggest headache all along, and now she was gone. But as much as I wanted to think it was over, I knew better. Brenda wasn't the type to fade quietly into the background. She was wounded, furious and desperate. And desperate people do desperate things. The fine hadn't gone away. The lawsuits hadn't been dismissed. And Brenda, stripped of her little HOA throne, had nothing left to lose. That's when she made her most reckless move yet. One that dragged in outsiders, escalated the stakes beyond anything we'd seen so far, and forced me to decide whether I was just a bystander, or the one person who could finally put an end to her reign of chaos. And I'll admit, even I didn't see the next twist coming. It started on a Tuesday morning. I was sipping coffee, reading emails, enjoying the rare quiet of a Brenda-free week. The neighborhood was calm, almost eerily so. No angry flyers, no screaming through Ring cameras, no HOA letters stuffed under doors. It was as if she had finally, miraculously, burned herself out. Then the trucks came, not delivery trucks, not USPS vans, real heavy-duty moving trucks. 3 of them, rolling into the cul-de-sac like a convoy. For a moment I thought, is she actually moving already? But the logos painted on the sides told another story. Local news network, one said. Another had a giant satellite dish mounted on top. The third was from some fringe community action group I'd never heard of. I walked outside, mug in hand, just as Brenda stepped into the street. She was dressed like she was running for office, pressed suit, pearls hairsprayed to perfection. She clutched a folder thick with papers and marched toward the news crews, like she'd just declared herself queen of the subdivision. "Ladies and gentlemen," she shouted into a microphone. One of the reporters reluctantly held out. This neighborhood has been under siege by government tyranny. I have been fined $50,000 for protecting our community's standards. I have been slandered, harassed, and betrayed. But today, I fight back. Neighbors peeked from windows. Some came out to watch, phones already recording. Brenda's press conference was exactly the kind of circus everyone had come to expect. But this time she wasn't just ranting about mailboxes. She announced she had filed a federal lawsuit against the United States Postal Service. Yes, the entire USPS. Her claim that the Postal Service was overstepping its constitutional authority by weaponizing mailboxes against homeowners. She waved her stack of papers dramatically, nearly smacking one poor cameraman in the face. Then she gestured at me, voice rising. And this man, this saboteur, colluded with them to entrap me. All eyes turned to me. I just sipped my coffee and waited. The reporters, to their credit, tried to press her on details. One asked if she had legal precedent. Another asked how she planned to fund a lawsuit against the federal government. Brenda dodged both, launching instead into a tirade about how patriots around the country would rally to her cause. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so dangerous. Because here's the thing, people like Brenda always manage to attract a fringe audience. Within hours her press conference was online. Within a day it had gone viral. Conspiracy forums picked it up, dubbing her the mailbox martyr. Suddenly strangers from out of town were driving past our cul-de-sac, just to gawk. Some even left flowers at the base of her crooked replacement mailbox, like it was a shrine. The neighborhood went on edge. Parents worried about strangers lurking near their kids. The HOA board, already humiliated, scrambled to issue statements distancing themselves from Brenda. The USPS predictably filed a motion to dismiss her lawsuit. But in the meantime we were stuck living in a bizarre fishbowl. And then Brenda went nuclear. Late one night, I was woken by shouting. I stumbled to the window and froze. Brenda was in my yard again. Only this time she wasn't alone. She had dragged two of her new supporters with her. They were hauling tools, a crowbar, a sledgehammer, even a shovel. I opened my door. You've got to be kidding me. Brenda spun, wild-eyed. This mailbox is a symbol of oppression. Tonight, we take it back for the people. Her companions cheered like this was some kind of revolution. One raised the sledgehammer. That was enough for me. Calm as ever, I pulled out my phone and hit record. Brenda, I said evenly, you're trespassing. You're about to commit a second federal crime on camera. You really want to add prison time to that $50,000 fine? For a second she hesitated. Then she screamed, you won't silence me. The sledgehammer came down, but not on the mailbox. Because just then, flashing red and blue lights washed over the street. Half a dozen police cars pulled up, sirens wailing. Neighbors poured out of their homes. Someone must have called when they saw Brenda marching across my lawn with her little posse. Officers jumped out shouting command. The two men with her dropped their tools immediately. Brenda, of course, didn't. She tried to argue, waving her folder of lawsuit documents like it was a magic shield. When they moved to cuff her, she shrieked, "This is illegal. I'm a board member." One officer deadpanned, "Ma'am, you were removed from the board last week." The entire neighborhood burst out laughing. Even the cops smirked. They hauled her to the cruiser as she screamed about suing every last one of us. By dawn the street was quiet again, but the damage was done. Brenda had crossed the line from nuisance to criminal in full view of the entire community. The news vans that had once filmed her speeches now showed her being shoved into the back of a squad car. The narrative flipped overnight. She wasn't a martyr anymore. She was a cautionary tale. The fallout was swift. Her lawsuit against the USPS was laughed out of court. The fine stood. The HOA board officially banned her from ever serving again. And those trespassing charges, combined with attempted destruction of federal property, they carried real consequences. She was staring down probation, community service, maybe even jail time. The neighborhood, meanwhile, thrived, freed from her constant interference. People planted what they wanted in their yard. Kids chalked sidewalks with abandoned mailboxes. Every shape, color, and design popped up like a silent act of rebellion. Mine was restored exactly as it had been, courtesy of the Postal Service, and I polished it every week like a trophy. The best part, the USPS inspector stopped by one last time, shaking my hand with a grin. You'd be surprised how many complaints we get about mailboxes. But this takes the cake. You ever consider running for the board yourself? I laughed. Not a chance. I like winning from the sidelines, and that's exactly how I felt. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't thrown tantrum. I hadn't torn up anyone's property. I just stayed calm, played the long game, and let Brenda dig her own hole. By the end, she wasn't just in over her head, she was buried. The neighborhood learned a lesson too. Power-hungry people only thrive when everyone else is too tired to push back. But once someone stands up, once you shine a light, the whole facade crumbles. Brenda had built her identity on control, and when that control slipped, she unraveled. Weeks later, after the news crews finally left, and the viral videos died down, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset. A couple walked past and waved. A kid rode by on his scooter, a mailbox-shaped balloon tied to the handlebars. Peace at last, and as I looked at my shiny, perfectly ordinary mailbox standing proud at the edge of my lawn, I couldn't help but smile. Who knew a chunk of metal on a post could topple an entire reign of terror?